Well, there was once a weaver woman who was married to a farmer, and they lived very contentedly together. One day a knock came to the door, and there was a tinker woman. Well, the weaver woman was known for her hospitality and her kindness, so she brought the tinker woman in and put a fine spread on the table before her. There was a big pot of freshly brewed tea, there were scones, there was jam, there was cream. The tinker woman ate her fill, and then she said, "And may you be blessed with the birth of a beautiful wee baby girl." Well, 9 months passed, and sure enough, the weaver woman had this gorgeous little girl. And her and the farmer thought that their hearts would burst with pride at this lovely little girl they had. Well, this little girl was about a year old when a knock came to the door, and there was the tinker woman again. Well, just the same as before, the weaver woman brought her in and put a lovely spread on the table, and the tinker woman sat down and ate her fill. And then she said, "Thank you very much once again for your kindness and your hospitality, and may you be blessed with the birth of another beautiful baby girl." Well, sure enough, 9 months passed, and they had this lovely little girl, and they thought that their hearts would burst with pride. This wee girl was gorgeous. Well, this wee one was a year old, and her sister was 2 years old, when a knock came to the door again, and there was the tinker woman. Well, it was an awful day. It was pouring with rain, and I don't know what got into that weaver woman that day. I think she was a bit exhausted looking after these two wee totes. But whatever got into her, she turned the tinker woman away at the door. She didn't even invite her in out of the rain. And the tinker woman turned on her heel and she said, "Well, may your third daughter be as ugly as a little goat." And sure enough, 9 months later, the weaver woman gave birth to this wee girl, and she had a wee tuft of red hair coming out at the top of her head and a wee red goatee beard. But the weaver woman and the farmer, they loved this little girl just as much as they loved the first two, and they called her Maureen Rua, Maureen Red, because of her red hair. But the sisters of Maureen weren't keen on her at all, and as those 3 girls grew up, Maureen's sisters loved to go off into the village by themselves, because when they went by themselves, sure, everybody was admiring them and chatting to them. But when they took Maureen with them, well, the best of the people spat out hello, and the worst of the people walked to the other side of the road. But time passed, and the girls became teenagers, and you know what life is like. Good times don't last forever. And very sadly, the farmer died. And the weaver woman did her best to make ends meet and look after the girls. But when they were about 18, 17, 16, she said to them, "Girls, I'm really sorry, but you know, I can't look after you anymore. You're going to have to go out into the world and make your own way." She said, "What I'll do though is I'll make some bannocks for you, for your journey. I'll use up what's left in the oat barrel." So the weaver woman, she took the oat barrel and she emptied it out and she made these bannocks, but there was only enough for 3 bannocks, and there was 4 of them, counting her. So she went to the oldest of the girls and she said, "Now daughter," she said, "would you like half a bannock with my blessing, or would you like a full bannock with no blessing?" And the oldest daughter was very pragmatic, and she said, "Well, I'll be hungry soon enough, so I think I'll just take the full bannock, and I'll do without your blessing." And then the weaver woman went to the second daughter, and she said, "Now daughter," she said, "would you like half a bannock with my blessing, or would you like a full bannock with no blessing?" And the second daughter said the same as the first, "I'll take the full bannock and I'll manage without your blessing, mother." But when she went to Maureen, and she said, "Maureen, would you like half a bannock and my blessing, or the full bannock with no blessing?" Maureen said, "Mummy, I would really like to have your blessing for my journey, and so I'd be more than happy to take half the bannock with your blessing." Well, the 3 sisters set off together. And the 2 oldest ones, they couldn't wait to be rid of Maureen. They tried everything. First of all, they tied her up to a tree. But she was that clever. She got loose and she ran down the road and met them at the crossroads. Next of all, they pushed her into a bog. But she got out of the bog as well and was waiting for them down the road. So they decided they would have to put up with Maureen. And that night, they got to the castle of a giant. Well, they didn't meet the giant. They met his wife, who seemed very kind. And she said that they could stay the night there. And strangely enough, she had 3 girls much the same age as themselves. So she said, "You can share the room with my 3 daughters." Well, Maureen felt very uneasy about this castle. She just knew that something was amiss. So whilst her two sisters slept soundly, Maureen stayed wide awake and looked around the room. And she noticed that the giant's daughters had these 3 nightcaps on their head. So she crept out of bed and she took the nightcaps off their heads and put the nightcap on her own head and the heads of her 2 sisters. And then she took the bed that her sisters were sleeping in and she pushed it right to the far corner of the room. Well, a wee while later she heard the giant and his wife outside the door, and the wife was saying, "Oh, husband, if you're determined to kill them, I suppose I can't stop you, but for goodness sake, don't be killing our girls. Don't get our girls confused with these 3 visitors. Our girls are the ones with the nightcaps on their heads, and they're closest to the door." Well, the giant came into the room, and he felt, and he felt, and he felt the nightcaps on the heads of his own girls, and thinking they were the visitors, he slit their 3 throats, and he put them into a great big sack, threw the bag over his shoulder, and he said, "I'm going to roast one of you, I'm going to boil one of you, and I'm going to fry one of you." And off he went with the bag with his 3 girls in it. Well, Maureen woke up her 2 sisters, and they jumped out the window, and they ran as fast as their legs would carry them all the way to the next town. And in the next town was a great big hill, and on the top of the hill was a castle. And they went to this castle, and they knocked on the door, and by this point it was dawn, and they were taken before the king. Well, fortunately this king was a very kind man, and he listened to their story. And he said, "Well," he said, "that giant that you escaped from, he's the bane of my life, Maureen," he said. "That giant, he has a cloak of invisibility. Maureen, is there any way you could get me that cloak? Because if you could, I would arrange for your eldest sister to be married to my eldest son, and you must see, as I can see, how much these 2 have fallen in love." Well, Maureen would have done anything for her big sister, so that night she went into the giant's castle, and over the end of his bed was the cloak of invisibility, and she put it around her shoulders, and she walked straight out the front door, over the drawbridge, and all the way back to the town where the kind king lived, and she gave him the cloak of invisibility. Well, he arranged a feast that night to celebrate, and at the feast he was full of praise for Maureen. And then he said, "Maureen, that giant has something else that I would really like. He's got a sword of light, and if you could get me that sword of light, Maureen, well, I would arrange for a wedding for your middle sister and my middle son, and you must see, as I can see, how these 2 have fallen for one another." Well, Maureen would have done anything for her middle sister, so that night back she went to the castle of the giant, and she climbed up onto the rooftop, and she put herself right over the chimney where the giant's wife did the cooking. And the giant's wife was stirring a great big cauldron pot full of bones. It might even have been the bones of her own daughters. And she was seasoning it with a wee sprinkle of salt. And every time the giant's wife put in a wee sprinkle of salt, Maureen threw fistfuls down the chimney. Well, that night the giant was in his bed, and he was tossing and turning. He was saying, "Oh, I'm so thirsty, I'm so thirsty." And the giant's wife was saying, "You've drunk every drop of water in this castle. If you want more water, you'll have to get out of your bed and go to the well." "I'm not going to the well. You go to the well." "You should go to the well. You're the one that killed our 3 girls." "I'm not going to the well, and if you don't go, you'll end up in the stew with them." "Oh, but I can't go out in the dark, husband." "Take the sword of light," he said. So out of her bed she got, and she lifted the sword of light, and away she went down to the well. But she couldn't draw up the bucket without setting down the sword of light. And as she set down the sword of light, Maureen crept out from the bushes, took the sword of light, and ran as fast as her legs would carry her back to the castle of the kind king. And she gave him the sword of light. Well, he was delighted, and he had a great feast of celebration, and he said, "Maureen, there's one last thing. That giant has a pair of 7-league boots, and if you could get me those 7-league boots, Maureen, I would arrange for you to be married to my youngest son." Well, truth to be told, when the youngest son of the king had first seen Maureen, he wasn't very taken with her, but by this point he realised that Maureen was very special, and he gave Maureen a wee nod to let her know that he would love to marry her. And back she went to the castle of the giant. And she crept into his room that night, and there were the 7 league boots at the end of the bed, and she put on the 7 league boots. But they were very big and very clumpy, and as she walked out of the room, she woke the giant. And he leapt out of his bed, and he grabbed hold of her by the tuft of her red hair, and he pulled her straight out of the boots, and he said, "Now I've got you, my fine colleen." And he put her into a sack, and he took her into the kitchen, and he flung her over the rafters, and he said, "Now I'm going to roast you, but before I roast you, I'm going to get a big stick, and I'm going to tenderise you." And away he went into the forest to get himself a big stick. Well, Maureen swung back and forwards up from the rafters in her wee bag, and she went, la 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 la. And as she was singing to herself, in came the giant's wife. And the sound of the singing reminded the giant's wife of her 3 lost girls. And she said, "Oh, why are you singing, lassie?" And Maureen said, "Well, I'm singing because I'm looking forward to going to heaven." And the giant's wife said, "Would you take me with you? I'm awful tired of living with that grumpy old so-and-so." "I'd love to let you come with me," said Maureen, "but there's only space for 1 to go." "Well," said the giant's wife, would you maybe let me go instead of you?" "Well, I could," said Maureen, "but you'd have to get me all the things that your husband has stolen from my friend the king." So the giant's wife went round the castle, and she gathered up all of the stolen treasure, and she gave it to Maureen. And she took Maureen out of the sack, and she climbed in the sack, and Maureen hung her up on the rafters and headed back to see the king with all of his treasure. Well, when the giant came back in the kitchen with his big stick, he began beating and beating and beating at the sack hanging from the rafters. And soon he recognised the voice coming from inside the sack, and he took out the sack and opened it up, and there was his wife. And when his wife told him about going to heaven and about all the treasure she'd given back, well, the giant was absolutely livid, and he set off after Maureen. But she had on the 7 league boots, so she managed to stay ahead of him until finally he was just about to grab hold of her tuft of red hair when she got to a river, and she sailed over the river in her 7 league boots, and he fell in after her and drowned, and that was the end of the giant. Well, Maureen got back to the castle of the kind king, and the king was so happy with her he gave her a great big hug, and he began the preparations for the wedding of Maureen and her 2 sisters to his 3 sons. Well, that was a marvellous wedding day, and when Maureen got to the top of the church and she turned to look into the eyes of the youngest son of the king, and he looked into her eyes, he saw past all of the peculiarities of her face right into her heart, and he saw the shining essence of Maureen, and he saw how Maureen inspired everyone around her. And so still to this day in Ireland, Maureen Rua is a name which is given to queens and daughters of queens, and to young girls who might one day grow up and have the gift to change the world.